What is going on, you guys, and welcome back to the channel. In this video we're going to be continuing with our T3 stack application, which is an AI journal. And in the last video we looked at setting up the layout, so now we have this nice little home page. We can sign in with GitHub, and once we're signed in we're redirected back to our home screen. We have our entries page, which tells us that we don't have any entries, and we have our right page along with our entry detail page. So if we do / and then some value here, right now it's empty, but we'll be filling that up in this video. So what do we want to do? So we need a few endpoints here. So we need an endpoint that will list all our entries. We need an endpoint which will show a single entry, and we want an endpoint that will allow us to write our thoughts and then submit them. So let's head back to our code base and let's have a look at what we need to do. So these endpoints, if you remember from the first video when we were going over the structure of a T3 application, we have a server directory right here. And in that we have this API, and then in there we have our routers. So if we go inside routers, we already have an example one which they gave to us when we install this application. So we already have this hello, this get all, and this get secret message. Now we can see with the hello that if we were to go ahead and use that, we can go and, let's say in the entries page, let's go ahead and call it and see what it does. So we'll say const, and this is in the entries one, and we'll just do something like that, and then we'll type in API, and for me it automatically imports it, but you could import it like this. So import curly brackets API from @utils / API, and then if you dot, you'll see example, which is the name of the router, and then we'll say dot, let's get hello, and use query. And the reason why we're saying use query for this one is if we go back to example.ts, this is a query. There are other ones. There's another one called mutation, which you'll see later. In that case, it will be called use mutation. But in our case here, we'll say use query. And that's because we want to get data back. That's why it's called use query. And then right in there, we'll go ahead and say, what shall we say? The data that we're going to pass in, because this takes in text. So if we go back to hello, it says that it needs an object and it has one property, which is text. So let's go ahead and add that in. We'll just throw in T3 is cool. And then with that, we get a bunch of return values that come from it, or from the object that's returned. We are just interested in the data. Let's go ahead and save that. And if we go down, let's just add it in here. We'll get rid of it in a second. Say data, and then data.greeting. Why greeting? Well, first of all, if we look here, it returns the data itself is returning it has a property of greeting, and that is hello, and then whatever our input was. And so if we go back, we can see that we have to, in order to output it, we're doing data.greeting, and this question mark here is because we don't get that result immediately, that this will only show once we have our response. Let's just add a color around it, so text neutral 50. Now if we go back to the entries page, we can see here, hello, T3 is cool. So that's how you can make a use query call. Let's just go ahead and get rid of this. Now, before we jump into the whole tRPC stuff, let's go ahead and first create our models. So inside of the Prisma folder, we have schema.prisma. And we already have some models defined. And if you remember with Supabase, we just reload that. We already have our user model, our session model, etc. I already have one user in because I've signed in with my GitHub account. And if we go back now to our application, Let's go ahead and down here, we'll create a new model. And the first model that we want, and probably the only model that we need, is a entry model. So we'll say model and then entry like so. And I do have a Prisma tutorial up as well. Feel free to check that out. I will also it should pop up on the screen the moment I say this. So yeah, feel free to check that out as it goes over Prisma and how to set up Prisma and how all of the sort of features that come with Prisma works. Let's go ahead and add our ID, which is going to be a string ID and at default, and then CUID to generate the ID every time we add it. Content, so the content of our entry is going to be a string. We also have a user ID, which is a string, and the reference to that is going to be user and then user like that. So we're referring to our user model here, and the relation is going to be the user ID that we just defined here on the line above, and the references is going to be ID. So we want to refer to the user by the user's ID, so this guy here. And then if we delete a user, then cascade. All right, then we'll have a date created, date time, default we'll set to now, and we'll have our mood rating. And we're going to focus on this part in the next video. And we'll set that to a optional field, so a nullable one, because the mood rating will not be generated straight away. Now, let me just get rid of this. Now, if we go up, you can see it automatically added a entry array to my user model. This did that for me automatically because I've got a Prisma plugin on VS Code. However, if you don't have that, please do add that, as you will need it as a reference. But all right, so now we have our model entry. So let's go ahead and create our migration. So we do npx, and I'm just down here in my terminal. Let me just expand that a bit. So npx, let's just clear it all first. npx prisma migrate dev, like so. Hit enter, and it's connecting to our Postgres database at this source, so the Supabase one, and we'll say entry model. And there we go. Now if we head back and go to our Supabase interface, we'll see that we have, if I refresh, an entry model here. Right there, it's empty right now, but you can see we have the columns ID, content, user ID, date created, and mood rating. And if we look at the definition, we can see that mood rating can be nullable as we defined. Everything else is not nullable. And yeah, there we go. And it's also added in our foreign keys, etc. Cool. So let's go back and let's go back to the code. So now we have our entry model. That's our Prisma stuff sorted out. As you know, it's a very simple application. Most of it was already set up for us, like the user and the account. Let's go ahead, and if we open up the server directory and in routers, let's go ahead and create a new router, and we'll call this router, so new file and then journaling.ts, like that. So in order to create a router, the first thing we need to do is import Z from Zod, and that will allow us to ensure that we have type safety. And then import from @/server/API/tRPC. And if you're wondering where is this coming from, as this is not coming from an npm package, this was automatically set up by by the T3 stack. So when we installed it, and this is this here, so this just deals with all the tRPC stuff. We don't have to touch this. So let's just head back, and what we need from there is the create tRPC router and also the protected procedure. Now the protected procedure is going to allow us to create endpoints which only allow for authenticated users. All right, so then let's do export const and then journaling and then router equals create tRPC router. And the reason why I ended this with a router is because it's just good practice to have that there so you know what exactly it is. And then here we'll pass in an object. Now the first one we're going to create is a create entry. So we'll say create entry. And then this is going to be a protected procedure. So one that only an authenticated user can use. And instead of query, we're going to have input like so. And this means that it's going to be like a post request. So you can kind of see the similarity between that and a normal HTTP. So we'll be sending in an object, and that object is just going to be the content. So we'll say z.object, and then in here, we're going to have a content, and that is going to be a string. So content z.string, like so. All right, so that's this, and then we need to do we're going to say mutation, and we'll say async and ct, actually in there, an object. Let me just shrink that. So it's asynchronous function, and it will take in a context and our input. And then here we'll say curly brackets like so. So let's just quickly go over what we have. So we've created a new endpoint. This endpoint, we're calling it create entry. It's a protected one, meaning that only an authenticated user can access this. So someone who signed in with their GitHub account. Then the input for this is going to be an object which has which only has a one property, which is content. So something like this, basically. Passing in hello world like that. That's what it expects. And it's a mutation. And the reason why we're calling it a mutation is because we're writing to the database, or we're changing something to the database. This is why it's that. And async was an asynchronous function, and it takes in two parameters, the context and the input. Or I should say it takes in one parameter, which is this object, but within that object we have a context and we have an input. Now with this context, as you'll see, allows us to access the session, so to check the authenticated user, and also allows us to have access to the database. And this input is this guy here that we defined. All right, so let's go ahead and say const equals ctx, and we'll take out the database from this, like so. And we'll also take out the session. All right, and then we also need our content. So we'll say const and then content equals input. All right, so let's create our new entry. So new entry equals, and then await db dot entry dot create, and then in here we'll pass in the data. So now we're writing to our database. We'll say content and then just content like that, user ID, and that is session.user.id. Okay, so this is us, and as you can see, this DB is coming from context or CTX. So we have straight access to our database. It doesn't mess around with like leaving open connections or anything. That's why it's good practice to use a database from CTX. But all we're doing is creating a new entry, passing in the content and the user ID, because the rest of the values are generated automatically. And what we'll do then is say select, and we'll say ID is true. So all this is going to return is the ID of our entry. And that's all we need, because once we've submitted an entry, it will redirect us to the entry page. And then finally, let's go ahead and just return that. Return new entry. Perfect. So now what we can do is let's head over to the right page. And this is this page here. So we're on here. And when we submit this, when we click finish, we're going to send that data to the mutation that we just created. So how can we do that? Let's go ahead and in here we'll say const equals and then API dot journaling, and we need to register it actually. So let's go back to our server, and inside of root.ts we already have our example router, and I'm just going to leave that in there. But let's go ahead and add our journaling one as well. So we'll say journaling, and that is going to be journaling router, and that's just been imported here. I'm just going to go ahead and fix that import. So we'll say at server and API like so, just so it matches with the others. But now we have our journaling router registered in root.ts. So let's go back to write.tsx and let's go ahead and make that call. So again, it was const and then equals API, and this was imported just here. So import API from at /utils/API, and then we'll say journaling, and here we have our create entry, and we'll say use mutation. All right, so this mutation, what we'll do is once it's done, we're going to send it to our /entries/ and then the ID of the entry. So the cool thing with this is that we can say on success. So in here, we'll create an object in there with the object. We'll say on success and then data. And then if you just hover over that data, you'll see that the type it's returning is an ID of string. And this is where the usefulness of type safety comes in, because if you remember back in our journaling, I actually spelled that wrong, journaling. Should change that maybe. We are returning only the ID. So we're saying create the new entry, but just select the ID and return that. Let's just rename that so we don't have any typos. Rename journaling.ts, and yes, this fixes that. Let me just close these ones getting in the way. Save root.ts, and here we go. Yep, so you can see here the data only has an ID. It's an object that has ID, which is a type string, and then we can say replace, and then here backticks /entries/ data.id. There we go. So what we need from the use mutation is a function called mutate, and we'll just call this create entry and the data that we get back. So data new entry. Actually, we don't need that, so let's just leave it at this. So this isn't automatically called. We have this function, this create entry function that we've taken from mutate, and we can call that once we've submitted the form. Let's go ahead and create and don't worry, I'll go over this again after we've just done this part, just in case some of you guys are a bit confused. So here, handle form submit. So you may have done this before in previous React applications. The React dot form event, and this is a HTML form element, and we'll say e.prevent default, and then create entry, content, and the journal entry, which is the use state that we had right here. All right, and then in this handle form, let's go ahead and say on the form tag, we'll state that on submit, we want to call the handle form submit function. So we'll say on submit equals, and then e, or the event sent to the handle form submit, and pass in the event there. All right, so before we test this out, I just want to go through what we did. So we have this API call here, this API journaling create entry, which is what we just created here. And what we're sending, what we're saying is that this is a mutation because we're writing something to the database, and with that it comes with all these different sorts of functions. And then we are also accessing this create entry. You can access a bunch of other things that come with this. So like, for example, you can say, I want the status of it. What else is there? I want to see if there's an error. Is it idle? Is it loading? Is it paused? So all these things, we're not going to go too deep into that because yeah, there's a lot to unpack there. But if we go down here in this handle form submit, we're making that call create entry, and we're passing in our journal entry. And then we're saying that once this is done, if it succeeded on success, route us to this entries / data.id. And we'll see that now. So I'm just going to go ahead and restart this server because it may have issues if you've made changes to the database. So just to do that, just in case. All right. Fast refresh, had to perform full reload. Okay, all good. All right, now we're here in our write. So let's go ahead and type something. I had a very productive day. I woke up early and fed the birds. Let's just say that. Go ahead and click finish. And now we've been routed. If you look at the endpoint, our endpoint is this. So the CLNFP07. And now if we head over to Supabase, we can see that we have the exact same entry here for our entry model, entry table. And there you go. We have the date created, the user ID, the content, the ID for the entry itself. We don't have a mood rating. We're going to get to that in the next video. But all right, let's head back. And let's now go ahead and in the PID file, let's create an endpoint. We'll create an endpoint that fetches a entry based on its ID. So inside PID, this is where we're going to be using that. And then inside our routers or routers in server, back inside journaling.ts, let's go ahead and create a new endpoint. And we'll call this one the get by ID, get entry by ID. Let's do that. So get entry by ID. This again is going to be a protected procedure, and we'll say input and then z.object, and then in here we'll say we need an ID of string, and what else? This is going to be a query, so dot query. So this is not a mutation. Remember in the last one we added a mutation. Mutation, just remember that if it's only a mutation if you're changing something in the database, whether you're adding something, deleting something, or updating something. In this case, we're just going to be reading from the database, so that's why it's a query. That's just a helpful way to remember this. All right, and in here, async, and we want the context, so the CTX and the input. And here, let's go ahead and write in the meat for this. So we'll say const ID equals input, and then the database, so we'll get the DB and the session from CTX. Then we'll say const entry equals await DB dot entry dot find first. And we'll say where the user ID, because we only want to get the user that signed in, we don't want to be reading anyone else's, session dot user dot ID, and then we'll get ID, and let's just return it now. Return entry. All right, so that's how we get entry by ID. Nothing too fancy. We're just saying get the entry where the user ID is the one that belongs inside the session and the ID of the entry itself. So let's head back to pid.tsx and let's use that. So inside this, let's go ahead and make the call to that. So just where we have our use effect. Above that, let's do this. Let's say const equals API dot journaling dot get entry by ID dot use query. All right, and in here we're going to say the ID is the ID that we get from our like query parameters. So we need to access this, and in order to access this, we can use some of the stuff that comes from the use router hook. So just here we'll say query, and we want to make sure that it's a string, so we'll say const ID or entry ID equals, and then array, because this can either be a string of arrays or just a single array. So we just need to guarantee that it's an array. It's a string dot PID. If it is an array, then query dot PID. This is just to make our type safety happy. Otherwise, query dot PID. And then in here, we'll say ID like that. All right, and the reason why that is complaining is cannot find out because we need to be entry ID. There we go. So just to kind of give you an idea of what we're doing, this use query takes in an object which is ID, and this can only be a string. And sometimes when we're accessing the query from use router, it can also be a list or an array of strings, and we want to guarantee that it's always just one. So we're saying that if it is an array, just select the first string, otherwise just give me the string. It shouldn't really ever be that, but just in case, just to make typing happy. All right, then we will say that only call this when the ID is not undefined, because remember, when this page loads, it takes maybe like a very short amount of time to get this ID from the query. So we want to make sure that we only call this once we've got it. So what we can do is say enabled equals ID does not equal undefined, or entry ID. I keep writing ID. It should be entry ID does not equal undefined. So again, just to go over this, what we're saying here with this enabled is we only want to call the this function, this get entry by ID, when the entry ID exists, once we have it. So we don't want to call it when it's undefined, because if it's undefined, then we're going to get an error. And so in here, what we can say is we want the data, and we'll say entry data, we'll call it that. And let's just get the status as well. So we'll say status, we'll call this entry status, and yeah, let's leave it at that for now. So all right, now if we go back actually and we click on the console, and if I just refresh and just zoom in a bit, you can see that we're sending this here is sending off the entry. So it's saying get entry by ID, and you can see that we're sending off the input of the URL. I maybe should have shown you this earlier, but then the return, you can see the arrows heading in the left direction. If we open this, we get this result in there, and if we open up the result, we get this data, which is the content that we need. That's perfect, exactly what we need. We need the data so we can show it on the screen. So if we go back, let's go ahead and start adding that in. So we'll say just underneath, just inside this section, we'll say if the entry data does not equal null, then what we want to do is the following. Let's create a div, div like so. We'll have the class name mx-auto flex width a half, flex column, and then gap 5. And then here, let's say div, give that a class name of flex row, items center, and justify between. Now let's add the heading. We'll set the heading to like the date. So we can say entry data dot and question mark, because we cannot guarantee that it exists like in every single moment. So when it does exist, then we can access it. Date created, it's just 2 ISO string. I know it's going to look ugly. We'll clean that up later on. And then we can add in the content itself. So let's see. In the just underneath, I guess we can say underneath this here, we'll add a p tag. And oh, let's also make sure that we have a color for this. So this h tag, be able to see it. Remember, we have a dark kind of theme going on. Font pop-ins and text 3XL, font extra bold, and text gray 50. That. So if we go back, we can already see we have the date coming back. It looks super ugly. We will use like the moment library to like clean this up. Then underneath this, go ahead and say that the value here is going to be the entry data dot content. And remember the question mark. For me, it automatically adds it if I forget. And then class name and white space dash pre dash line, because we want it to preserve any of the new lines that we added. Background, we'll set that to like a gray 900. Font, we'll set that to Montserrat. And text, we'll say large. And text dash gray is 50. All right, go back now. You can see here that we have our content. Maybe we can add some padding to that, because that does look a bit slim. So padding 5, maybe. Head back. There we go. I had a very productive day. I woke up early and fed the birds. But all right, that's the. Now we can see, like, if we go back to right, let's add another one. Hello world. Finish, and there we go. Cool. So that's our entries page more or less sorted out. But I want to add a library that will help us clean this up. There's a very popular one. It's called Moment. So let's just Google that, Moment.js, and we'll use that. So it's this one here. And we can go ahead and install it. So I'm just going to take npm install moment dash dash save. Let me just stop the server and install it. All right, run the server again. And now what we'll do is use moment to clean up this ugly looking date. So we'll say, let's get rid of all of this for now. We'll say moment, oops, island moment. And we need to import it. I thought it would automatically import it, but it didn't. So let's go ahead and do that. So we'll just say import moment from moment. And down here, let's go ahead and pass in the value for moment. So the first value is going to be entry data dot date created, and remember the question mark, and we'll have it in the format of month and then day and then year, like so. Go back, let's have a look. And if I just refresh that, there we go, October 7th, 2023. All right, so that's our moment set up. It'd also be cool if we could delete a entry as well. So let's go ahead and back in the journaling.ts, let's create a new endpoint which will sort out the deletion process. So we'll just say, it's fairly simple. We'll say delete entry. It's going to be a protected entry, protected procedure. Input will also be the object, and this will take a ID. So we'll say ID like that, ID z dot string, and then we can do is say mutation, because remember we're making a change to the database, so it should be a mutation. Async ctx input, and then let's go ahead and just click save so it formats it. There we go. We'll just get the const ID equals input, the database, and the session. We'll get that from the context. I think CTX stands for context. I mean, it usually does. And then db.entry.delete, and we'll delete where the user ID is the one signed in, because we don't want users deleting other people's entries, whether it's malicious or by accident. ID, and ID is just ID. All right, so there we go. There's our delete, our mutation, and we're not returning anything because it's just deleting. We can return like a success, but we already have all of that within this anyway. So let's head back to the PID, and we'll also make a call to delete. So what we can do is we can say that the delete one we'll have here, const equals API dot journaling, and then delete entry and use mutation, say on success. We want it to redirect us to the entries page. So we'll say replace, and actually we don't need backticks because it's a fixed page. Entries, and it's / entries, not entry / forward, like that. All right, and we can get the mutate from there. So we'll say mutate, and we call this deletion. How do we name the other one? All right, so deletion mutation, just call it that. All right, so now let's go ahead and add a delete button. So to do that, let's go ahead and in here, so we'll have like a delete button right there where my mouse is. And so if we find the right place, so we have this div here, flex row, and then right underneath that, let's go ahead and add a button, and we'll say, we'll just give it the trash icon, so trash icon, and this is coming from the hero icons that we had installed like I think in the last video. So this trash icon there, and we'll give that a width of say 25, and class name we'll say text gray 50, and then in button we'll say class name, and then rounded -sm bg gradient to bottom right from gray 700 to gray 800, padding 2, and then on click we'll call the mutate deletion. So when we click that, we already have the mutate deletion on. So where's it, deletion mutation, right there. Let me just save it so it formats it, and then we just call that, and we need to pass in the ID, and there we go. This is the entry ID, and there we have it. So if we go back, there we go, we have our delete. Let's just reload this, click delete, and we get sent right back to entries. And if we go back to Supabase, reload, we only have one entry, and we're all good. So let's see what else. Let's write something else here. Today is a lovely day. Let's add some paragraphs in there. I like to eat food. Finish. And there we go. You can also see that we're preserving the new line as well. All right, so let's go back. So that's our deletion entry sorted out. Next, we need to work on the entries page itself. So where we list out all our entries. So let's go back into journaling.ts and let's create a new endpoint, so to speak, and we'll call this one get all entries. Get all entries. And this, of course, is going to be a protected procedure. And it's going to be a query because we're not changing anything in the database. Async and then CTX. And because we already have, the reason why we're not passing in like an input or anything is because we only need the user ID, and the user ID already comes with the context as we can access it through the session. So here, let's go ahead and say const and then db session CTX and then const data equals await and then db.entry.find many, and we only want it for the user that's signed in. So where user ID is session.user.id, and we want to order it by date, so in descending order. So order by date created descending. All right, and then finally let's just return that right here, return data. There we go. So that's our get all entries. Now if we go back to the entries page, so the index.tsx, let's go ahead and make that call. So for that, we'll say const equals entries. Oops, this should be API, and then journaling dot get all entries, and then dot use query. And we'll say, because usually we would pass in an object for that, so like the ID, for example, like we did in this one. So in the ID on the entry page and single entry page, we have this where is it, this use query, and we pass in this ID. In our case, because for the get all entries we don't need an input, what we can say instead is just type in undefined. There we go. And then we want to say enabled when session, or enabled like that, when the session status equals authenticated. So only call it when you're authenticated. And then we'll get the data and then entries data like that. So again, what we're doing is we're calling our get all entries and we're passing it undefined because we're not giving it an object or anything like that to query or base a query off. And then we're saying only call this when the session state is authenticated. So if it's loading, if it's unauthenticated, don't call this, wait until we're authenticated and then call it. Because otherwise you'll get an error because the context won't have it may not have, you can't guarantee that the context will always have the user ID in there or a session in there. But now we have our data, so let's go ahead and map them. So first of all, we have this no entries, and this will only be shown if we have no entries. So what we'll add is entries data dot length, and then equals, so triple equals 0. Then we'll say no entries. Otherwise, what we'll do is have entries data dot map, and remember the question mark because again, entries data may not exist. It's like at the very beginning it may not exist. So hit this map entry, and then what we'll do in here is add a link, because when you click on one, we want it to send it to the entry, so the entry page itself. So we have link already imported now. This just automatically imported it. So import link from next/link. And down below, let's go ahead and first add in the href to stop it from complaining. href, and then /entries / and then $ the entry dot ID. And that entry dot ID, this entry that we're getting is coming back from our entries data. We're just mapping over it. And then the key as well, because React will complain, especially when mapping, entry dot ID. And then we'll just give it some classes. So we'll say mx auto flex width 1/2 flex row rounded dash sm. Background we'll say slate 800, padding 10. I could be a bit more consistent with the colors, but anyway. And then inside this, let's say div class name, we'll say truncate, because we're going to show a part of the entry itself, not all of it, because it will take up too much of the space. And then padding, paragraph, class name, we'll say font Poppins, and then text dash large, and text gray 50. And then here, entry dot content, there we go. And then, and the reason why we're not getting a question mark, we need to put question mark here, is because we already have it here. So like the parent of it already has it. So in this case, it's assuming that entry exists. And all right, so underneath that, let's just add the date as well. So we'll say moment. And this again automatically imported it for me. So import moment from moment, and we'll have it as entry. Whoops, entry dot date created, and we'll format that. Need the bracket there as well. Format, and we'll say mmm. I'll just do, let's make it shorter a bit. do yy, like that. Now, if we go back, we have go to entries, and there we go. Let's just change the color of the date. So we'll say class name, and we'll add, should we add text? Let's give it a faint color like that. Let's also give it a font, say Montserrat, like that. Cool. So now we can click on one and we see what we have. We can go back, click on another one, and it's ordered in descending order. So this is the one that we wrote first. So the most recent one, it shows up, and then to the oldest one. All right, so that's our entries working now. So if we go back, let's have a look. So we're now mapping over all of our entries, and we're getting it. We're only fetching these entries if we're authenticated. So let's log out and just test it. So we're back here. First of all, we can't go to entries, but do we get any breaking changes? So entries like that. No breaking changes. Let's try access entries. And what was the name of that ID? Let's get one from here. So let's take this guy, copy cell content. Let's paste it in just to make sure we can't access it. And no, we can't. We get sent right back. All right, cool. So let's just also check this here. So if we were to do the exact same thing, entries / and then paste, we're getting this error. I mean, there is a way of handling this error. You can see here that we're getting all this. As long as we're not getting the data back, that's the most important part. Like we're getting a 401 unauthorized, which is what we want. We're just not doing any like detailed error handling. But as long as the user cannot access it, that's what's most important. All right, so that's the, oh, you also get it here as well in the console, showing you the error. But that pretty much sums up the backend for our application. We will be continuing the backend in the next video because we'll be adding in the OpenAI API to add the AI into our application. But otherwise, I hope you enjoyed this video. Feel free to contact me on Twitter. I will add my Twitter link in the description. But otherwise, stay healthy, stay safe, and I hope to see you in the next video.